The story of Atlantis is embedded right in these very significant and substantial geological events. Mainstream ignores that fact. On the other hand, I look at it and go, well, this may be more than mere coincidence.
Yeah.
If we go to Plato's ringed structure, he describes a city plan where there are multiple rings. There's the Temple of Poseidon at the center, one stadium in length and half a stadium in width, right? It's a rectangle. It's twice as long as it is high, which is the rectangle from which you derive the golden section.
Aha. It's clearly pointing to some kind of like lost sacred technica that was both esoteric and priestly, but also practical. And I think we see the practical outcomes with sacred statues, with alchemy, with these megalithic structures. I don't think we even have begun to scratch the surface of what it really is. And what it really seems like it is some kind of sacred language comprised of geometry.
Yes.
And maybe I'm reaching by saying it's being suppressed, but that's what it feels like.
Well, it feels like that to me as well. And it is a device for the controlling of cosmic energy in the form of plasmoids. Wow. And I think we are literally on the verge, on the threshold of recovering what has been basically lost for thousands of years.
Randall Carlson, we had to have you back expediently because I committed the cardinal sin of not talking to you about Atlantis and a number of other things I really wanted to get into with you. And I boned up, or I reboned. Hey, I made a childish joke at the beginning of the last one that went over your head, but you got that one. So we're making progress already.
Okay. Well, in spite of the fact that we didn't talk about those things, I have forgiven you for this faux pas. And now we have another opportunity in front of us. And you indicated to me you wanted to talk a little bit about Atlantis, which I love to talk about Atlantis. And of course, I'm like everybody else out there that has an opinion on Atlantis. I think that I'm right and everybody else is wrong. Except the difference in my case is that I am right and everybody else is wrong.
Yeah.
Not really.
I love what, from what I know of your theory, I love your theory. But if you'll let me ramble for a minute or two to just do sort of like an introductory monologue. So a lot of people who watch the channel know I'm hugely influenced by Plato.
Okay.
And anybody who is a student of Plato probably knows this. Anyone who may not know this, is that the origin of the Atlantis story does come from Plato. It comes from the Critias Timaeus dialogue. And there's so many interesting things about that dialogue. One unfortunate thing is that Critias is unfinished. It's a dialogue that sort of is paired together with Timaeus, because the idea is it's a day at the academy. They're actually like there's a visiting teacher who's this Pythagorean scholar named Timaeus. He, as the titular figure, gives this long speech about essentially the creation of the cosmos, which is very esoteric, incredibly influential, but is almost strangely paired with this Critias dialogue, because Critias is this other guy who's there. And it starts with, first they review the Republic a little bit, and then Critias starts talking about Atlantis. And then he's like, but before I talk about Atlantis more, we're going to do this whole long speech about about the birth of the cosmos for some reason. Then it goes back to Atlantis. But what's interesting is I don't think these are paired together for no reason. I think there is some reason why they're paired. I'm not sure why. Like, I could start speculating, but that's interesting in and of itself. And another thing that I think is incredibly important, because most scholars dismiss, Plato's Atlantis as a myth or as like a story device for multiple reasons. But one of the things that's very interesting is Plato does often distinguish in his dialogues between this is a mythos, this is a logos, meaning this is a story. And when he says mythos, he doesn't necessarily mean it's a false story, but he means I'm going to tell you a story versus like a more technical teaching, a logos. And Critias, at least, says this is an absolutely true story. He insists that the Atlantis story is true,
Yes, he
even
does.
though almost basically all scholars say that, no, it's mythological. So that's interesting in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and before I go further, and get into any of the specifics about it, what would you add of the sort of, setup or the framing that you think is really important?
I would say that you're right that most modern scholars are very dismissive of it. But if you look at the history of Atlantean thought, pretty much Aristotle and his school concluded it was fictional, that it was an allegory.
Okay.
On the other hand, the Neo-Pythagoreans, and Proclus, Crantor, and that whole school coming down through the Arab world believed that it was actual, that it was based upon actual history, maybe not in every detail, and that did not exclude the possibility that Plato was using it allegorically,
Right.
right? But that behind the allegory, there was a literal, factual reality.
Yeah.
And what I have done in my approach is to go through Plato's accounts line by line. I think I've gone through 4 or 5 different translations.
Mm.
I've also procured the original Greek, which I've
Yeah.
slogged my way through, which I should have actually pulled it out and had it in my fingertips here because I wanted to see, like when he says veritable, I wanted to see what the meaning of the original Greek word was.
Yes.
When he says, when the English translation says island, I wanted to see what is the original Greek term,
Right.
right? And in both cases, I mean, it's what I expected. Veritable meant truth, that it was true, that really was. And he uses that word, like in the Jowett translation, the one that I've probably read the most, maybe 4 or 5 times through that particular translation.
Yeah.
The word veritable is used multiple times to
Yeah.
express the idea that, hey, this is no mere fiction.
Yeah.
This is real. I mean, he said you cannot, from the internal narrative itself, conclude that it's fictional. Because, in fact, he says the opposite repeatedly, multiple times. And we can quote, I can give you some of those quotes here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there
And-
were 2 schools of thought. And
yeah. And the other thing I think is just very, very interesting that a lot of people, again, do not know is that the primary role of Atlantis in this story is like a foil for this antediluvian, super ancient Athens that they claim coexisted at the same time. So, if I'm remembering this right, I think it's like 9,000 years pre Plato. They're saying
9,000 years pre-Solon.
pre-Solon. So
Who,
9,000 years
yeah.
pre-Solon. So he's like another 100 or 200 years before.
Yeah, he's about 600 BC was his journey to Egypt.
So So this is just another thing that's very easy to be like, come on, there was no ancient pre-diluvian Athens. And the story, and I guess now it kind of makes sense to get into some of just a little bit of the story, is that Atlantis is like this massive, very powerful island nation that's like invading Europe, right? And then they fight the Atlanteans, and the Atlanteans kind of fight them back. And then they all get swallowed up by some kind of huge cataclysm, right? Like they all get swallowed up by an earthquake.
Yeah, and that's something that's typically overlooked is that I call them the proto-Athenians, they're destroyed. The armies, they were destroyed in what basically, using his terminology, sounds like an extreme catastrophic erosional event, which would imply what's usually the trigger of erosional events is extreme pluviation or rainfall.
Yeah.
And that's kind of what, you've got to take that into account. And looking back, the 9,000 years prior to Solon's exile, if you want to call it that, self-imposed exile to Egypt, where he heard the story, according to the account, from the Egyptian priests, that 9,000 years prior, which basically, if you figure 2,600 years ago, what Plato was like like he was 350, somewhere right around there BC.
Mm-hmm.
So Solon was like 4 generations previous. If you look at that, the math on that, it's very simple. Go back 2,600 years to Solon, and then 9,000 years prior in the sacred registers of Egypt, according to their sacred registers that are referenced by the priests. This is when the Great War took place, which was immediately, I think we could infer that it was immediately after this war when the Atlanteans were driven out of the Mediterranean by the combined efforts of all of the cultural groups that existed inside the Mediterranean, but led by the Proto-Athenians, drove them out, and then essentially immediately after, there was a great earthquake. It caused the subsidence of Atlantis, and there was this erosional event that likewise, I think that was even a term used in the translations, that likewise destroyed the ancient armies of Athens and caused this, what sounds to me like an extreme erosional event. Now, geologically, which is the perspective I come from,
yeah,
those two things are totally plausible.
very interesting.
And there's a coincidence that is either ignored, or if it's acknowledged at all, is just dismissed of having any significance whatsoever. And that's the idea that there is a proposed extreme meltwater event at 11,600 years ago. So there's a meltwater event where there's a massive influx of glacial meltwater into the global oceans, although most of that is going into the North Atlantic, which I think is significant.
Yeah.
And this event takes place now, documented through multiple proxies. Most probably importantly would be radiocarbon dating, but it has been dated to essentially 9,600 years BC, which would be 11,600 years ago, which dovetails maximally within a century, probably less, within a few decades of the date that we derive from Plato's account, that there was this seismic event along in the mid-Atlantic that referred to that caused the subsidence of the island. But my reading of it is that it's actually talking about a main island plus some subsidiary islands.
Yeah, because that's one of the things that, if I recall, they say Atlantis is quite large, right? Like it's don't they say it's bigger than
Libya and Asia combined?
Right. And then you have to ask, like, what did they know about in terms of Asia? What were they considering Asia in that whole calculation? So it's complex, but it would be quite large.
It would be large, certainly, but their geographic range of what constituted Asia and Libya was much more constrained. And essentially, Asia meant, going somewhat into Asia Minor, but not the whole of, Russia and Siberia and Tibet and China and all of that part of Asia. They didn't presumably have that comprehension. My suggestion is that, it does refer to an island. Obviously, if it's an island that's as large as Libya and Asia together, it doesn't sound like an island to me. It sounds like a continent.
Right.
But here's where I think it could be talking. If you're talking about the Atlantean, quote unquote, empire, and the Atlantean empire could include like the Azores, Macaronesia. If you look at the individual islands, they're small. They're not huge. If you look at the area of Macaronesia, it's many times larger. If you were to draw a circle around Macaronesia and include all 9 islands of the Azores, if you were to extend it even more and include Madeira and Canaries, now you've got a huge area. Just like Polynesia. I mean, I looked up, I think I have it in my PowerPoint show where I looked up what is the area of Micronesia, right? Or Polynesia. Well, you see that the area encompasses all of the islands of Micronesia. So if you look at it that way, which is how I think that could possibly be interpreted, in fact, that makes more sense to me than the idea that he's talking about a landmass the size of Libya and Asia together. That doesn't make any sense.
Can we back up and tell the story a bit more? A bit more of the story. Who Solon is, how this information came to be. The whole story about the Egyptians, sort of all that fun stuff. Do pardon the interruption, my friends. We riff on a lot of somewhat obscure esoteric ideas, both on the channel collectively and in this mind meld in particular. And you're going to specifically all the time hear me blabbing about the Hermetic and Platonic traditions. Even getting to the core of what those are is somewhat of an intellectual labyrinthian adventure. But when it comes to that adventure, you should 100% make this beautiful limited edition version of Giordano Bruno and the Hermetic tradition a part of that adventure. It profiles the hugely fascinating Giordano Bruno, who lectured on cosmology, philosophy, memory, and many other topics through the prism of Hermeticism and Neoplatonism. And if you don't know Bruno's story, he's eventually arrested and burned at the stake for espousing his philosophy. And another note on the influence of this book, I think I first heard about it in a Terence McKenna lecture. So it is one of those books you're just going to keep hearing about. So if you're going to get this version, my friends, but it will sell out, and do get it via our link that's in the description. It's also up on the screen now. And by the way, the guys at Gallo Glass Books, they are so cool. They really have their hearts in the right place. They're making super high quality products, and they're really trying to do this content justice. So I love supporting them.
Yeah. So Solon was a famous poet, philosopher. He was a statesman, a lawgiver. He was a highly accomplished individual. He lived roughly around 600 BC in Athens. And, I don't remember the specific circumstances that led to his disenchantment with the political situation in Greece at the time. And so he exiled himself. He went abroad, and he ended up in Egypt. And it was while in Egypt that he met these priests, and the priests related to him the story of Atlantis and referred to it as occurring not prior by 9,000 years, according to their sacred registers. And I'm going to deviate for a second, because sure, I've seen a lot of academic opinion that has said that, well, that's absurd, because you're talking about presumably an oral tradition that lasted for 9,000 years. Such things don't exist. Well, I would beg to differ, and I would think that the evidence suggests that oral traditions have lasted for thousands of years. And most recently, I've been doing research on the oral traditions of the Paiute and Shoshone tribes that live out in Nevada. And there's a very interesting story that has some light. So I'll take a minute or two to discuss this story.
Yeah.
Okay, so in 1940, a husband-wife archaeologist team were excavating in a cave, and they found two cadavers that had been buried there. One was obviously younger than one. It was buried not as deep. The deeper burial was undoubtedly older, and it was mummified. Well, they estimated that the date of the mummified individual was between 1,500 and 2,000 years. Now, this is in 1940. The mummified remains, they went to a museum, and I think they actually went on tour. I forget where they are right now, maybe back in the museum out in this is in Nevada. I think there was I think they're back in the museum. They're probably sitting in storage now.
In the Smithsonian next to the Ark of the Covenant somewhere, like at the...
undoubtedly.
Yeah.
So if anybody listening breaks into the Smithsonian...
The Nephilim giant bones and all the other fun mythological stuff.
Well, okay, so get this. Now get this, Michael. Okay, so here's the story. Because you said that, I'm going to elaborate just a little bit more, but I think you'll see how it has relevance, okay? So in 1997, after a long controversy, because the Paiutes and the Shoshone wanted reburial under the auspices of the Native American Graves and Repatriation Act, but they agreed to allow radiocarbon dating, which was subsequently done. And the mummified turned out to be almost 11,000 years old.
Wow.
Yeah. Now, this is an individual found in a cave in Nevada. Okay, so now in I think it was 2004, again after more controversies and back and forth, the tribes agreed to a DNA testing, right? Well, what this showed was that this individual, who according to the tribes was referred to as the storyteller. The cave was called Spirit Cave, so oftentimes he's referred to as Spirit Cave Man, right? So they, and the man who did the DNA testing was the same individual. I believe he was Danish. Yes, he was Danish, and he was the man who did the DNA testing on the Kennewick man that was found along the Columbia River that turned out to be 10,000 plus years old.
Okay.
Right? The Kennewick, I don't know if you remember that big controversy. Yeah, Kennewick man, you might want to look him up and do a little research on that. That's Kennewick, Washington. He was found in some of the residual flood deposits of the final gasps of the great Northwest Pacific floods.
Wow.
Right? So he was probably drowned in a flood. Kennewick man. Same geneticist that did the DNA testing on the Kennewick man. The tribes agreed to allow him to do it. They didn't want any American scientists to do it because they didn't trust American scientists. But they did trust this Danish geneticist. So he came in, he did the DNA testing, and sure enough, it looked like there was a genetic link between Spirit Caveman and the modern tribes. Now, the modern tribes have their own stories and legends. They talk about that this was their ancestor, and at the time he lived, their ancestors lived on the shores of a great lake, and there were extensive glaciers on the mountains nearby, right? Well, there was a great lake. They were called Lake Lahontan that disappeared at the end of the last ice age, right? And it was probably a product of, the great ice masses over North America probably pushed this is one theory, and it makes sense, pushed the jet stream south. So during the ice age, all the deserts of southwestern United States were not deserts. They were temperate environments. They were even lush. They were like savannas.
Wow.
But they were not deserts.
And that was how long ago?
Well, this is 12,000, 15,000 years ago.
Incredible.
And then even post-glacial, there was a lot of more rainfall in those deserts, just like there was a lot more rainfall in the Sahara, probably for the same reason. Sahara Desert was not a desert 10,000 years ago.
Right.
8,000, they call it the Green Sahara. Now,
and that plays into some of the other theories about Atlantis, right? Like the Richat structure and all that stuff.
Sure. And we can come back and talk about the Richat structure if you want. But so back to this Spirit Cave story. So the Shoshone tribes, the Paiute tribes, they've got stories about their ancestors living on the shores of this great lake that existed where it is now desert. It was called Lake Lahontan, and it was in the northwest corner of Nevada. Do you know the Burning Man Festival?
Oh, yeah. Never been, but yeah.
Yeah, so the Burning Man Festival. No, but in the last 2 years, I'm kind of glad I wasn't out there wallowing around in the mud.
Maybe we can go together sometime.
I would probably be up for that. Oh, but see, I have a secondary reason for that, because what is it, the Black Rock Desert, it's called, I believe? That was where they hold that out there on that flat desert land. That was the bottom of Lake Lahontan. The lake, when it was at full pool, was over 500 feet deep, right there where Burning Man takes place.
That's crazy.
And I guarantee you, probably none of the attendees of Burning Man understand that.
Probably not.
I would be going out there with the idea in mind is I want to study the remnants and the evidence of that gigantic lake. It was the second biggest lake in the whole Basin and Range province. The biggest one was Lake Bonneville, which where Salt Lake City and Great Salt Lake are located. That was the largest basin of Lake Bonneville, and right there where the city of Great Salt Lake is, the Lake Bonneville was over 1,000 feet deep.
Wow.
Lahontan at its deepest point was 900 feet deep, 900 plus. So it wasn't quite the depth of Bonneville, and in the bay where Burning Man is, it was shallower. It was about 500 feet deep. Okay, so here's the point. So here's the Shoshone tribes and Paiute tribes have these traditions about their ancestors living on the shores of this great lake, well, which disappeared between 10 and 11,000 years ago. So they have a cultural history of that story. The 2004 genetic testing showed that it appeared in all, the evidence suggests they were descended or related genetically to this spirit cave man.
Yeah.
Now, in earlier 20th century, I think it was in 1912, there was a rancher who owned a ranch, and it was near the spirit cave. I don't know what he was excavating for some reason. He was excavating for maybe a well, but there was another cave near there called the Lovelock Cave. Now, these caves, by the way, very much correlate with the high water mark of Full Pool Lake Lahontan, and were probably eroded into the native limestone bedrock by the surf and the energy that was being expended along the shorelines of this gigantic lake. There's evidence that there was a lot of turbulence, and so Lovelock Cave also was very close to the Full Pool shoreline of Lake Lahontan. Well, in that cave, in the early 20th century, they found 60 mummies.
Wow.
And they found some evidence of footwear that would have been basically worn by somebody probably in the range of 7'6" tall.
Wow.
Like 15 or 16-inch long sandals, right?
Wow.
So now go back to this farmer. I don't remember his name. I could pull it up here. I've written extensively about this whole episode. And I'm going to actually be I'm working with my friend Beckett Fusick, and we're putting together a mini documentary about the story I'm telling you right now. But so he's excavating, and he finds a skeleton. Now, according to the local accounts, and I was actually able to go back to the Lovelock Review, I believe it was called, and found online, they have archives from the 1930s when this rancher was doing this excavation. And I got a screen capture of the actual article where he's talking, where they're talking about in this excavation, he discovered a skeleton that may have been of an individual close to 8 feet tall.
Wow.
So
yeah, and just
the final point is that the tribes themselves have ancestral memories of and saying there were giants.
Right.
There were giants, and in fact, their ancestors fought a war with the giants, and the final standoff between the two groups was there near Lovelock Cave.
Yeah. And the details of this escape me, but there are many, many stories of European travelers coming to the Americas and apparently seeing giant humans, right? Like that are around this size. South America, Central America, North America. There are stories like this of very, very large humans.
There are a lot of stories like that. And I've done some research, as others have gone much deeper than I have, but I've done enough research to think, yeah, there's got to be some historical truth to this. It's not just coming out of a vacuum. All these people are independently making up these various stories.
Right.
And right here in Georgia, Etowah Mounds. Now, this is interesting. We have these monumental earthworks here in Georgia, just north of Atlanta, about an hour, called Etowah Mounds. They were excavated when? In the 1940s, 1950s, I think, initially. You can go to the museum that's there on site, and they've got the displays about the cultural groups, the Native Americans who presumably did all the construction work, at where did they excavate, what were their crops they're growing, what were their lifestyles, all of this. Nowhere in the museum, at least since the last time I was there, which has been a number of you, probably just pre-COVID, do they mention the fact that in the excavation of, I think it was Mound C, there's Mound A, which is the big truncated pyramid, and there's two smaller ones, and I think it was Mound C, one of the smaller ones. Yeah. There's no mention of the fact that they excavated and found the skeletal remains of a giant. Yet I have the original. I have photocopies of the original reports
Wow.
from this, where they explicitly are saying they find the skeletal
Yeah.
remains of 7 foot plus, right, individual.
So
Why does
that,
not the museum
yeah,
even mention that?
that begs the question. Okay, so there's some big humans. Big deal, right?
Yeah.
Unless it plays into something else that is something that's bordering on forbidden history, like potentially another hypothesis you're fond of, a sort of advanced other that we could call, we talked about last time, this breakaway civilization. What if these humans that are larger, or I mean, or perhaps not human, or related to us somehow, or not related to us somehow, what if these large skeletons are related to that, and that's why these are suppressed pieces of history? Because I can't for the life of me figure out why would there be some effort to suppress the notion of just humans who happen to be a bit larger? That's not that novel. But if it's
Well,
related to something else, then it could be very novel and very interesting.
well, maybe the insights that I kind of feel like I've gleaned from looking at paleohydraulic data and evidence for gigantic scale floods, what I refer to as biblical scale floods.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking about, a supernatural drowning of all the highest mountains in the world by some inexplicable process. And I'm not talking about some catastrophic but merely local or regional effect. You've got right now you've got two schools of thought, and this sort of applies again to the same question of Atlantis. You've got the academic school, the scholars, which say, well, if there was any real reality to these flood myths, well, it was just a large flood, that was regionally or locally devastating, and then it just got exaggerated into retelling until it became the whole world. That's sort of the academic, oversimplified, of course, but it does kind of express the academic.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas on the other hand, you have the evangelicals and the biblical literalists and true believers who do believe it was a supernatural flood that, they have various ways of trying to explain it that make no sense at all from my standpoint scientifically,
Yeah.
where the whole planet is submerged. When you get into the details of, like, wait a second, and some of the skeptics rightfully will say, well, wait a second, are you talking about aardvarks from South America somehow getting on Noah's Ark over in the Middle East and that sort of thing? This gets us into another question, because I think that maybe what is being referred to there, and again, this is not to get into that now, but it's certainly an interesting discussion, is that
Mm-hmm.
in an impending catastrophe, it would be natural for at least a somewhat advanced culture to want to preserve as much ecological diversity as possible.
Yeah.
Right. So in the aftermath of a catastrophe, you could replant, replenish, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. And how advanced of a civilization are we talking about? If we're talking about a not very advanced civilization, that sounds pretty outlandish. If we're talking about a civilization more advanced than we appreciate or understand from our modern perspective, that suddenly becomes not so unlikely.
Right. And it's so, from what I've studied, though, I mean, I've been out in the field. I've covered at least several 100,000 miles, literally, in the last quarter century, in the field, personally studying, observing, documenting evidence for large scale fluvial hydrology.
Yeah.
Okay. We're talking about flood discharges, peak flood discharges that in some cases are well over 500 million cubic feet per second.
Wow.
How do you even visualize something like that?
Can't.
Well, I'll tell you this. I very confidently refer to a flow of water on that scale as being biblical in scale, in the sense that if you were in a landscape where you had the ability to survive an event like this,
Mm-hmm.
um, and I'll segue for a second. I take people on tours to teach them about catastrophic or cataclysmic paleohydrology in the field, show them how to read the landscape. When I take a group, one of the first places I take them in eastern Washington is a place called Steptoe Butte. Steptoe Butte's about 1,200 feet, rises. It's an old volcanic core, hard volcanic rock that rises about 11 or 1,200 feet above the surrounding rolling Palouse farmland.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the rolling Palouse was shaped by huge volumes of water moving relatively sluggish over the landscape, as opposed to a little further west where you can see huge volumes of water moving at rapid velocities. Well, as you increase the velocity of moving water, you also increase the erosive potential of that water.
Okay.
If it's slow, it's going to tend to maybe entrain sediment, but like not transport it. You know, in some of the flood pathways that we go through, we'll see piles of boulders that are the size of school buses and bigger.
Wow.
Those are boulders that are being carried in some of these peak discharges. If we had a ability to share a screen, I would pull up and I would actually show you some photographs of these, of the features left over, because when you have 500 million cubic feet per second flowing over the land, after that flood is over, it's left very distinctive, very impressive geomorphic work on that landscape.
Yeah.
That once you know how to read it, it's indisputable, unmistakable. Okay, so here's what I'm getting at, is that if you were up on top of Steptoe Butte during the peak of this, say, some of these great floods that swept over eastern Washington at the end of the last ice age, and you were somehow lucky enough to survive, in the aftermath of that event, in every direction you would see as far as the eye could see, whatever had been there was gone, was wiped out.
Wow.
And that's the reason I bring people there for one of our first outings. You get on the top of there and you have a 360-degree view of the horizon. And when I took Graham Hancock on this tour of the floodlands, one of the first places we stopped is at a place called Wallula Gap. And it's right up on top of a cliff, and there's a mile-wide gap, 1,200 feet deep roughly, where all of this flood water coming from multiple sources out of Canada and Montana converged on this gap. And as you look to the east, again, as far as the eye could see, everything that you're looking at would have been underwater. As far as the eye could see, and you're looking at 20, 30 miles because you're up on this ridge.
Wild.
And the water that came through, where I took Graham, I brought him up to the point where we were standing right at the shoreline of the high water mark when all of this water is converging on this gap and forcing its way through. And you could look over on the other side of the gap, which was a little bit lower, which was now completely underwater, and you could see massive pothole erosion. You could see spired rocks that were left in the aftermath. Just, you could tell that there were incredible energies unleashed on this landscape, right? Now, all of this is due to the rapid and catastrophic melting of those ice sheets, which kind of brings us right back full circle to the question of Atlantis, because the story of Atlantis is embedded right in these very significant and substantial geological events. Now, mainstream, like I said, ignores that fact or just dismisses it as having any significance. On the other hand, I look at it and go, well, this may be more than mere coincidence.
Yeah.
This may be literally part of a oral transmission. And the reason I told the story about the Spirit Caveman is that there we have solid evidence that those tribes living in that area literally had an oral tradition that lasted for 10,000 years or longer. Right. If you go back, in fact, if they're talking about a tradition, our ancestors lived on the shores of a giant lake that was here, Well, they didn't presumably have the geological knowledge. When did geologists find out about that? I mean, it was early 20th century that they began to see evidence that there had been this huge body of water there,
Yeah.
right? And we're still learning about it, right? Well, how would the tribes have known about it? Well, they didn't have the scientific means at their disposal like we do now, but they had an oral tradition that appears to have lasted a minimum of 10,000 years.
Right.
So don't declare categorically that the Egyptians could not possibly have had an oral tradition that lasted for 9,000 or 10,000 years. But that's what they do to get around this discussion. So I made this.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I'm glad you did a great job of making sure that segue didn't become a non sequitur. I was worried for a little bit, but you brought it back beautifully. But
if you hang with me long enough, Michael,
yes, you do. You do bring it back. You do bring it back reliably. But yeah. So we have this sage, this ancient Athenian sage, who goes to Egypt. He is telling these Egyptian sages about, the history he's aware of. They give him this like pat on the head that's like, you Greeks are very cute with your history, but we have the knowledge of 9 cataclysmic cycles or something like that go back an insane amount of time. And I don't think it could be an oral tradition, but my God, we have barely scratched the surface of whatever the hell's going on in Egypt. All of this new stuff about the underground structures, not just the controversial scans, but things that we know for a fact are there at this point that have not been excavated. For all we know, could there be a hall of records? And then there's all the legends like the Pillars of Hermes and all these other things that who knows, man. There is so much about Egypt that we still don't have a clue about. And the idea that this couldn't be true is just like, okay, well, pick from a smorgasbord of miracles that we can basically, the ones we can see with our eyes that are on the ground, the ones that we know for a fact are under the ground, and then God knows what else. It does not strain my imagination to imagine that this could somehow, in some way, be true, part of a truth.
Yeah, and I do. Yeah, it seems to me that the status quo, the establishment interpretation of history, is getting more and more and more implausible. There's just too many things, too many outliers, too many things that don't fit that narrative without being force-fed into the dogma, right? The thing I cite all the time is the building with large mega blocks of stone that weigh 10, 20, 50 or more tons, hundreds of tons even in some cases. And, I did there was a short clip on a YouTube clip where I was talking about that went up a few weeks ago. And some of the comments, it's like, these comments are coming from people who've never given it like probably more than 15 seconds of thought.
Right.
And, well, they had all their leisure time, and so they had to do something with their slaves. I saw that version of the story. And, that has so many holes in it and so many inconsistencies and it's contradicted by history itself. And just, in my mind, common sense. There is something there that we haven't figured out yet.
Yeah.
And, hey, if you can make me a strong, conclusive case that it was all done with brute force, okay, but I haven't seen that. I haven't seen that. When you're talking about the transport of 100-ton stones or 50-ton stones over sometimes rugged landscapes, cross rivers, over mountains. There's something else there that we haven't really explained yet. But
yeah, and it's a combination of like what would have to be, this idea of brute strength or just clever leverage use and whatever. It would have to be a combination of that with insane precision. When it comes to these, Ben Van Kerkwyk talks about with these like incredibly precise granite vessels and stuff like that are pre-dynastic seemingly. Like what? It's just
Yeah,
the combination of the precision and what would have to be brute strength. It's one of those things that sort of just doesn't it just doesn't make sense in my mind. What does make sense is that there's something we don't understand. There's some missing technologies. Uh, you know, we talked a little bit about the technologies and the notion that there could be some sort of like sacred science involved in all of this last time. I don't know if we really completely, stated what your hypothesis or deepest suspicion on that is, and maybe we can go there as well. But before we do that, let's stick with with Atlantis for now.
sure,
And
sure.
yeah, so from there are some things in Plato we haven't covered because there are some specifics about, like the concentric circles and the descriptions of the landmass and all of that stuff that are um fairly significant. And not only are they significant from potential, is there any geological data that could correspond to this? There's got to be, because Plato is always doing this. He's embedding geometric principles and,
Hmm.
different kinds of, and not to mention again that this is stacked against Timaeus, which is filled with geometry. It's filled with harmonics. It's filled with,
Hmm.
hidden meanings and that we could spend, and people are still discovering, man. Like if you look up like analyses of Plato's Timaeus, there are still PhDs analyzing that text and finding new stuff. Same with Plato's Republic.
Hmm.
Did you hear
Hmm.
about, did we talk about there are people who are analyzing the structure of Plato's Republic, and they're finding that the overall structure of the whole dialogue is harmonic, and the point at
Hmm.
which the divided line in the cave is discussed, which, the divided line, for people that don't know, these are the like this is sort of like the epistemic and ontological outline of reality that Plato gives right alongside the cave allegory, and it creates a golden section, and it's
Hmm.
literally at the exact golden section of the entire dialogue itself. It's stuff like that. And you find out that there is like a musical scale structure to the entire work. And then you have to sit there and actually strain your brain to think about the
Hmm.
fact that Plato wrote a 200,000 word plus dialogue and made it fit like this. Just stuff like that. So the exact words that are talking about the divided line, which is a golden section, are also mathematically by word count a golden section of the entire dialogue. It's just stuff like that we can't, like, I don't think we understand the level of sophistication and genius that Plato was executing to a point where I think those dialogues in and of themselves are like literary megalithic pyramids,
Hmm.
where in the same way,
Hmm.
Randall, you do this amazing job of, analyzing these structures and showing everything that they encode, and how they are not just these like something we can simply dismiss as like a tomb or something, but they're like these geometric puzzles that encode the size of the earth and all these cosmic principles. I think that's what Plato was doing with his dialogues. So it's like
Hmm. Hmm.
when
Hmm.
we're talking about the levels of truth and logos that he's unleashing within these dialogues, it's like we can't even, I don't think there's a way to go too deep down the rabbit hole. I don't think we're going deep enough down the rabbit hole.
Sure.
So when he talks about things like, the capital of Atlantis being surrounded by these concentric circles and all of that stuff, I think you maybe you really need to like map. Not you. I'm just saying the general you. Um, we should be mapping this out. We should be drawing it when we're reading it. We should be, trying to think about every piece of geometric knowledge they could have been playing with while they were writing about this stuff. There's just so many levels, man.
Oh, there is. Now, how about this? And I'm going to segue a little bit, and then we're going to come back to the dialogues themselves. The Great Pyramid, Khufu's pyramid, there's two ways of measuring the base. One is the cornerstones that are on the sit right called the socle. they're 1 royal cubit. The socle is 1 royal cubit in thickness. And again, it's difficult to explain. I could easily show you in a couple of images, but
definitely send them to me. I will put them up.
Okay, so we've got corner sockets that sit just outside the remaining, called riveting, I think is what the term was. But basically, you had two ways of measuring the pyramid's perimeter, its base, right? So measured on top of the socle, and then that extended a little bit out, was 1 royal cubit thickness, which is about 20.6265 inches thick. And there were a second set of corners there. So the smaller distance sitting on top of the socle it varied, but it was all within a few inches or so of being 755 feet. Now the outer, where the sockets, which two of them are still there. So I've photographed them. You can measure them. They've been measured in surveys. They're 760 feet. So so basically what would you have is that the second set of cornerstones that sits just outside, I could actually draw and you would see what I'm talking about if this is very crude. Let's see if we can see it. So you've got the corner, the upper corner is this right here, and then it sits on the socle, this thing, and then there's the second corner here that's just outside. So just think of it a platform that extends a little bit outside the main body of the pyramid.
Okay.
If you measure the pyramid itself sitting on top of the socle, each side is roughly around 755 feet. If you measure the bottom of the socle where these sockets are, where there were prominent cornerstones there, it's 760 feet. Got that?
Okay.
Now, these are based upon multiple surveys. Okay, if we go to Plato's ringed structure, this is what he's describing. He describes a city plan where there are multiple rings, and there's the Temple of Poseidon at the center. Temple of Poseidon is 1 stadium in length and half a stadium in width. So it's a double square, right? It's a rectangle. It's twice as long as it is high, which is the rectangle from which you derive the golden section.
Aha.
Right? You take the diagonal of the double square, and it's the square root of 5. And the square root of 5 plus 1 is 1.618033989 ... Or square root of 5 minus 1 gives you the reciprocal of the golden section. And just like the king's chamber of the Great Pyramid is a double square. And I suspect that they understood the geometric principle that the golden section is hiding in there, right? Okay, so now you got the Temple of Poseidon that sits on the center island. It's 1 stadium by 2 stadiums. Then you've got a series of rings. So the inner island is 5 stades in diameter. Okay, well, a stade in the ancient Greek stade that they were using when Plato was writing was 608 feet. Well, 5 times 608 feet is 3,040. If you divide 3,040, I'm going to put that in my calculator. Let's see if you can actually, you actually see that?
Yep. Okay, right there I can see
3,000.
it. Yep.
So imagine a square that's 3,040 feet in perimeter.
Okay.
How much is each side length? Well, I'll divide by 4. And you can see right there, I think,
760. Yeah.
760 feet. Coincidence that that turns out to be that the perimeter, or that 5 stades happens to be the dimensions of the socket stones on the Great Pyramid.
Yeah. I mean, sidebar here, you are one of the deepest students of sacred geometry I'm aware of. So when you see things like this, what do you think they are trying to communicate, do, execute by doing this? What is it?
What this would suggest to me, and not this by itself, but if you could multiply examples like this, is that we're looking at some kind of a system of technology. And we now know, based on the work of some of the plasma technology that's being developed as we speak, the machines that are being built that creates the coherent plasmoids by subjecting them to electromagnetic fields that cause them to cohere into stabilized geometric forms require the proportions that we find reiterated over and over and over again in sacred geometry.
Wow.
Again, is this a coincidence? The number 432, which shows up in the Vedas, is one of those reiterative numbers. It shows up in the Sumerian king lists. It shows up in many places, right? It turns out that it's also the musical scale. You have an octave of 432 to 864, which is a different way of tuning than 440 to 880.
Right. Yeah,
so
the hertz. Yeah,
432 is the hertz, the wavelength of the note A, and then the octave up at 864.
Right.
So,
and we use
these are the kinds of
440 in the modern tuning.
Correct.
Right? Yeah.
Correct. Well, it turns out that some of the machines that are now being built and have been built and tested as we speak, for example, require concentric cylinders, concentric spheres. And the ratios of these concentric spheres turn out to be exactly these harmonic numbers that we find over and over again in sacred geometry.
And how did they I mean, this probably is maybe it's not a non sequitur, but I want to discuss this in more depth, but how did they figure that out? Like, where did that come from?
I don't know.
Okay.
To be quite honest, I don't know. But here's further. 3,040 feet, right? 3,040 feet is a half of a nautical mile.
Okay.
Okay. What is a nautical mile? Let's pull up here and I will see what they say for the definition of a nautical mile. Nautical mile. Here's what it says. A nautical mile is a unit of length used in navigation and defined exactly as 1,852 meters. We're not interested in the meters, but historically, it was defined as the meridian arc. The meridian would be a line. If you're standing outside and you look at the zenith overhead, and then you're looking at due south and you connected those by an arc, that's your meridian arc. Okay, so historically, the nautical mile was defined as the meridian arc length corresponding to 1 minute of a degree, 1/60th of a degree. So this is what I'm saying here, is if you double the 3,140 feet, you have a nautical mile, which is 6,080 feet. Okay. Notice that that's 10 times the length of the Greek stade, which was 608. Coincidence that they're using a unit of measurement that is derivative from the Earth itself? There are 21,600 nautical miles in the circumference of the Earth at the equator, 21,600. Notice that that's half of 43,200, which is just an exponential expansion of 432. So yeah, it goes on. So 3,040 feet times 43,200.
Yeah.
Right? That works out to be 24,872.72 miles. And that, if you divide that, if you consider that a circle, 24,872.72, divide that by pi, then you're going to get the diameter of that circle, and it turns out to be 7,917 miles, virtually the mean diameter of the Earth.
Yeah. Wow.
So over and over again, we're seeing these connections between ancient systems of metrology, ancient systems of architecture, the encoding of mathematical information into sacred writings, of which I would submit Plato was an initiated master.
No doubt.
Over and over again. Now, what does mainstream academia have to do to deal with this? Either just dismiss it out of hand, ignore it, or proclaim that anybody who is acknowledging this and recognizing coincidence on top of coincidence on top of coincidence is nothing but a pseudoscientist, a crackpot, etc., etc. Although I would submit that the real crackpots are the defenders of the status quo, because they're about to get left in the dust.
Man.
They are literally about to get left in the dust.
Do pardon the interloping, my friends. Can one interlope upon themselves? That is a brain tingler that we will save for another transmission. You may have noticed that I have shortened my introductions, yet tickling the algorithm, stimulating it in all ways does remain of the utmost importance. So please do like, subscribe, comment, share. I am trying to hit 200K subs at least before the end of the year. Also, we do have an ever swelling library of member-only / patron-only content, both on the YouTube members page and at patreon.com/third eye drops. If you do join via the latter, you'll also get access to a patron-only Discord server and access to live mind melds with myself, occasional special guests, along with, of course, a number of other seekers just like yourself. I do hope to commune with you there, but in the meantime, back to the mind meld. Particularly if this really does yield some kind of technological breakthrough. And this is something that, within, one of the other things I talk about all the time on the channel, like the whole UFO milieu, there is this like mythical energy system, and that might be anti-gravitic, might be plasmatic, might be related, somehow between those two things. And I suspect that there's probably some small group of humans that already know about this, already use it, already have developed technologies around it, and they keep it incredibly classified, incredibly cloistered. But if someone else in the general population figures this out, which is probably just a matter of time, and it sounds like from what you're saying, this could be already occurring. It's going to be one of those things where it becomes even harder to dismiss. And I already, deeply suspect, as we were talking about last time too, that there is this sacred science that's talked about by people like Zosimus, or in like these like technical Hermetica sorts of documents, many of which are not even translated. Almost nobody reads or understands like what the hell they're talking about. It's clearly pointing to some kind of like lost sacred technica that was both hieratic and esoteric and priestly, but also practical. And I think we see the practical outcomes with sacred statues, with alchemy, with these megalithic structures, with ancient temple building and stuff like that. And I don't think we even have begun to scratch the surface of what it really is. And what it really seems like it is some kind of sacred language comprised of geometry, some kind of sacred language that is almost like you can suppress it, but once you begin to see the patterns, as long as you're intelligent enough to see the patterns, you really can't suppress it fully. I think what you can suppress maybe is the outcome and how to put all the pieces together. And maybe I'm reaching by saying it's being suppressed, but that's what it feels like. I mean, and maybe it's just me being too dumb to understand it myself, but that's what it feels like to me.
Well, it feels like that to me as well. I may have gone a little further down this road than you have, because I've been looking into, and I've been privileged to be firsthand in rooms with scientists scratching their heads who've been testing some of these technologies, going, okay, we see that it's working. We see what appears to be the transmutation of elements right in front of us.
Wow.
What's going on? How is this working? We don't know, but it's working. And it's going to, I think, precipitate a technological revolution that's now getting underway right now as we speak. India is going full tilt boogie on implementing this technology, because for one thing, some of the earliest references to this technology are in Indian sacred writings. So it's auspicious that it's come almost like full circle.
Mm-hmm.
The Vajra, which was the symbol
Yeah.
of the instrument of cosmic power wielded by the gods, right? Well, the Vajra is a literal thing, and it is a device for the controlling of cosmic energy in the form of plasmoids. I think we can state that definitively now.
Wow.
And I think we are literally on the verge, on the threshold of recovering what has been basically lost for thousands of years, although it has emerged from its subterranean realms occasionally, um, just to let those in the world whose eyes are open to know that it existed. We see it. I think we see it evident at during Plato's, from the time of Pythagoras to Plato in there. I think we see it at the dawning of the Piscean age, at the advent of Christianity. And there's a whole lot of submerged depths to Christianity that have been completely overlooked that I think that is going to be important. And I know to put some of this out here, the stuff I've been researching is going to be incredibly controversial. But what has happened is you have the Christ of faith and you have the Jesus of history.
Yeah.
And right now in mainstream Christianity, never the twain shall meet.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, if there's any merit to this Christ of faith, there has to be this story, the Jesus of history, right? You can't ignore that. And to me, one of the questions I've always had, and this is not to get too far afield, is that, okay, let's look at the synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, or the book of John, and the history of these and where they came from and how they emerged from the milieu of the time is very interesting in it itself.
Yeah.
If you want to look at this historically and scientifically, without all the theological trappings that everybody's wearing their goggles, and they're only looking at this through this narrative that's actually been contrived within the last 300 or 400, 500 years, right?
Totally.
But when you go back to the original, here's a question to me. Arguably, Jesus was the most important individual in Western history, if not world history, in the last 2,000 years. Certainly, I mean, if there's a small group, if you want to talk, Buddha or whoever else, but who else comes close to whose influence and whose the impact of whose existence has reverberated through the ages, like Jesus, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, what do we really know about him? Well, we know, okay, if we look at the stories, and they're not all consistent either. He was born probably in a place called Bethlehem, a little village called Bethlehem. Ostensibly his parents are Mary and Joseph. We know that the book of Genesis, not the book of Genesis, but we know that in the Gospels, it goes into great detail on showing the lineage from King David down to Jesus, showing that Joseph was in that lineage, which I find an interesting question in itself. Why, if the birth is virgin, Joseph is merely a stepfather.
True.
And is not really in the bloodline of Jesus, right? But goes very distinctively to establish this bloodline, okay? Well, then what happens? Well, there's an anecdote about him being left behind during an excursion to Jerusalem, and Mary and Joseph are leaving, and they realize their 12-year-old son is not with them, so they hurry back. They find him in the temple discoursing with the elders. Then we hear nothing for the next 18 years until he shows up and gets baptized by John.
Yeah.
Now, the question I've got over and over again is, you know what? I sure would like to know about that story. What happened? Where did he go? Who did he know? Who did he hang out with? What did he study? What did he learn? Nothing. And yet this guy is presumably the most important guy in the Western world in 2,000 or 3,000 years. And what do we really know? Well, we know that he came and he spoke in parables. He did miracles. He upset some of the political hierarchy there in Jerusalem, etc. But aside from that, what do we know? Not much. But there is traditions out there that are very suggestive. And I think one of the things this leads us into is that there were traditions about that survived in Gnostic Christianity that was for the most part suppressed once Constantine declared, after his conversion, and declared Christianity being the official religion of the Holy Roman Empire. And then they did all of the conferences whose primarily purpose was to suppress all what they defined as heretical.
Right.
And to come up with a doctrinally approved version of Christianity that would support the idea of empire, basically. Well, I think it surfaced again in the High Middle Ages. It surfaced in the form of Catharism, and I think it also surfaced in the form of Templarism.
Right.
It surfaced in the form of the multiple Grail romances that saw the light of day between about 1150 and 1225 AD.
Yep.
At the same time, the great Gothic cathedrals are being built, which are nothing less than textbooks of the ancient Hermetic science, in my opinion.
Yes, and I was going to say, if you read some of the Apocrypha, like the Gospel of Thomas in particular, which is a text that many people think could be among the oldest texts. And that sounds incredibly Hermetic, Platonic, esoteric, and like he sounds, or like yogic even. Like he sounds like an initiate who woke up to his, like in the same way like Plotinus woke up to his connection to like had a henosis experience and communed with the one. It sounds like Jesus had like an incredibly similar experience and understanding of self that he was trying to initiate other people into. And then, of course, as you're pointing to, there's this esoteric Christian strain in the Middle Ages. But what's also interesting is we know that Christianity eventually like absorbed Hellenic philosophy. So like in the Alexandrian age, and the late antique age, you get a lot of Platonists and Hermeticists sort of like reluctantly getting gobbled up by Christianity, and they Trojan horse a lot of Platonism and a lot of Hermeticism into Christianity.
Sure.
People like Synesius in particular, who was like a student of Hypatia, stuff like that. It's in there. And it's like concealed, but not very heavily concealed. It's like it's pretty easy to find. Like once you know the history, you know the people, you look at what they wrote, and it's like, oh, they were trying to essentially Trojan horse theurgy or other big doctrinal and metaphysical ideas from Platonism and Hermeticism into Christianity, and they did it pretty successfully.
Well, and this is why I'm a student of the Bible. I read the Bible because I believe that, if you some cases read between the lines, in other cases it's right there overtly, and you have a context of understanding the traditions that preceded, the traditions of Mithraism, for example, which at one point was the primary competitor for Christianity. Again, when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, Mithraism kind of fell by the side of the road and kind of was forgotten. But the incredible richness of the symbolism in Mithraism is mind-boggling.
Yeah.
And in my opinion, complements the symbolism and inner meaning of the early Christian doctrines.
So for people that don't know, do you want to do a quick or I can do a quick Mithraic summary?
Yeah, go ahead. I'd love to hear what you got to say about it.
Yeah, so it was like this initiatic tradition with degrees that existed in the Roman period, and it was this it mostly revolved around this solar deity like Helios Mithras. But I was just talking to another friend and guest on the show about the liturgy, the Mithraic liturgy, and it's this whole it's part of the PGM, the Greek magical papyri, and it gives this whole overview of this incredibly esoteric initiatory ritual that's like this sphere ascension ritual where you're meeting all of these entities and going through all of these like rings of intelligences basically, until you get to this almost like, Henosis experience of communing with Helios Mithras. And then there's all the speculation about, substances that may have been used and what the actual technica was that would get people into these states to experience these things or whatever. But it's it's incredibly interesting.
Oh, very much. And you didn't mention that the essential ritual of the Mithraic ceremonies was the tauroctony, which was the slaying of the bull of heaven.
Yeah.
Which in itself is just literally loaded with significant symbolism beyond, I think, the discussion we're getting into tonight. But if you want to reconvene at some point to discuss that further,
for sure,
maybe we can even figure out how to do this where we can do some share screens.
Yes.
And as we're talking, for example, just now as you were talking, I was thinking, I could have pulled up that slide while you were talking.
Yeah.
I
know that image. I'll definitely share it. Yeah.
Yeah. So, anyways, yeah, I think that the bottom line here, and again, to try to keep to the theme, is that there is far more to human history on this planet than has been recognized within the conventional framework of thinking. There's a whole lot more to prehistory. And I find it almost ludicrous to think that we have been around for perhaps 150 to 200,000 years. We modern humans, Homo sapiens sapiens.
Yeah.
If we've been around that long, are you telling me that nobody discovered writing until 5,000 years ago?
Yeah.
Nobody figured out, everything was, passed down orally, and nobody, for generation after generation after generation, nobody progressed beyond foraging or hunter gathering, nomadic lifestyle. I find that hard to believe.
Me too. Yeah.
Right. And the answer to that to me is that it is almost more ridiculous to dismiss that vast period of prehistory.
Yeah.
With a wave of the arm and the belief that, well, there was nothing else going on there worth talking about. And if you try to speculate about anything advanced, and that is the key term, what do we mean? Let's define that. What do we mean by advanced? If we're going back to Plato, well, he's describing what you could say an advanced civilization, yet what is he describing? He's not talking about crystal ray guns and anti-gravity devices, any of that. What he is describing, though, is a very prolific seafaring culture, something perhaps that I think of as the Phoenicians or the Minoans on steroids.
Yeah.
That's kind of what he's describing. And he describes the activity of ships coming and going, and the canal that connects the ringed islands to the ocean where the ships could come in. And the canals were deep enough that the ships could pass under the bridges that scanned over the different rings. Now, I have two thoughts about that. One is that behind that there is some engineering, some mega scale magisterial engineering that they undertook, because we certainly know that ancient peoples were capable of tremendous feats of building, of architecture, of engineering. So we have this model of the ringed structure. Now, let's set that aside and say that's just the mythical part. Well, then that means the other part is, well, could you have had an island culture that had seafaring and navigational capabilities, which we know that humans were able to navigate and had seafaring capabilities tens of thousands of years ago, because islands all over the world have been colonized going back, in some cases, 50,000 years or longer. So somebody had to sail there. So, if you've got navigational skills, it also implies that you've got astronomical skills, because that's how you navigate by the stars, right?
Of course, yeah.
So you've got this idea, which I say, okay, let's assume then that the ringed city and all of that is just a geometric metaphor. Okay, let's set that aside for a minute and then what's left? Well, what's left is an island civilization that that became very prosperous, that had navigational skills, and had a far-flung empire. To me, that is not so implausible that we just dismiss it out of hand.
Right.
Well, and here's the thing that I think that mainstream archaeology overlooks. And in fact, a lot of geologists who've been schooled in gradualist narratives, gradualist scenarios. Everything changes one drop of water or one grain of sand at a time. And so within that framework, yeah, maybe there's a local or regional catastrophe, but nothing we need to contend with that would encompass the entire planet. Well, that view is obsolete. There are catastrophes we know repeatedly, just like Plato says.
Right.
There are catastrophes that have repeatedly happened. And again, when you finally it dawns on you and you get a realistic impression of what these cataclysms entailed, well, then you realize that, okay, if you're looking at a flood sweeping over the land, and this flood is literally approaching 1 billion cubic feet per second, which would be the equivalent of taking every single river on Earth. North America, South America. Think of all the rivers in North America. What are the biggies? Well, Mississippi, the Missouri, the Columbia, the Rio Grande, the Colorado, the Hudson, the Connecticut, the Mackenzie, the Yukon, all of those. Take the big rivers of South America, Orinoco, the Amazon, all the rest of them flowing out of the end. Take the rivers of Africa, the Nile, the Congo, etc., all of those rivers. Take the rivers of Europe and Eurasia. You've got the Yellow River. You've got the Thames River. You've got the Rhone, the Rhine. You've got these big rivers. Take every river on Earth, let them all flow together as one current. You're still not, to get to some of these flood currents that swept over the Earth at the end of the last age, you have to now multiply that by a factor of 10 or 20.
That is unbelievable.
It is unbelievable, but it's real. It's demonstrably real. And until you understand that, I take people to places where you're standing on the precipice and you're looking down into a chasm where literally 800, 900 feet of hard basalt bedrock has been ripped out by the power of this incredible power of these huge currents sweeping over the Earth. Over and over again, every continent, even Antarctica, has evidence of these kinds of floods.
Yeah.
So if you're looking at in most of these floods, in my shows, I'm now using a lot of LIDAR to show that pretty much every river on Earth has at one time or another carried hugely augmented flows. If you consider end of the Ice Age, the 400-foot rise of sea level, and this is no gentle rise. This is in itself a catastrophic event because you've got, in 1 year, you might have 10,000 cubic kilometers of water being dumped into the oceans of the world. This creates incredible turbulence. The meltwater pulses that we've been talking about, meltwater pulse 1b, 11,600 years ago.
Yeah.
There's Plato's date
for
the sinking of Atlantis, the subsidence of Atlantis. Now,
you've done it again. You brought it back again.
Yeah. So, so here we are back at the doorstep of Atlantis.
Yeah. And this would probably be a good pivot point to say, you think you know where Atlantis is?
Well, I'll put it this way. That's not quite accurate. Okay. Here's what I would say. Okay, there have been multiple places proposed for the existence of Atlantis. The book I'm writing is called Atlantis Back to Plato.
Yeah. Because
if you read every account of where Atlantis was, you have to modify Plato, some detail of Plato. If you accept the island Santorini, that was 900 years before Plato's time, right? Well, so those who are proposing that Santorini and the eruption of, was Torini the island? Terra was the island, Santorini was the volcano. I believe that was it. So it had this cataclysmic eruption caused huge tsunamis, was probably causing the destabilization of the quite sophisticated civilization that existed on Crete at the time, which went extinct shortly thereafter the eruption of Santorini, right? However, the way you get around it is you basically say, well, Plato made a mistake. Never mind that he mentions the date of 9,000 years prior to Solon's journey repeatedly, multiple times. This was a translator's mistake, or somewhere somebody made a mistake, and it was really meant to be interpreted as 900 years. He just forgot and left off a zero.
Yeah, he's not careful with his numbers or his math at all. He
I know.
Doesn't care
I mean, no, that's
kind of
literally
stuff.
been said.
Yeah.
So, and every other, same with this lately, it's the Reshat structure, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, your problem with the Reshat structure is, one thing, it's not in the Atlantic Ocean, and Plato's very explicit. It's also not an island. People try to portray it as an island. It's not an island. It hasn't been an island for millions of years. The ringed structure doesn't match the ringed city description at all. It's way too big, way too big. It's like 12 to 1,400 feet above sea level. Well, then you just got to throw out the whole story that Plato told, is that Atlantis subsided. That was the word he used, subsided beneath the ocean. Well, so we could go through and basically what I do at the beginning is I don't take all of the proposed areas, but enough of them to show, okay, here they have some truth in it, but then they lose it because they immediately start changing Plato's very detailed description.
Yeah.
So I said, and this was maybe 20 years ago now, I was giving a lecture in Asheville, North Carolina, and somebody asked me about Atlantis. And I said, well, it's been years since I've read Plato, but let me reread Plato and get back to you. So I reread Plato, and I saw things that I didn't see, like when I was like high school age when I had read it, or college age even. So I got kind of obsessed for a while, and I procured pretty much every translation I could find, and eventually even found the original Greek, and went through highlighting the Greek, using my Greek-English dictionary, my dictionary of classical Greek, to look up the words and all of that. And I came to the conclusion, well, if you just follow Plato's very explicit explanations and discussions and descriptions, where does that lead you? Without changing the details of the story. And it led me to a cluster of islands in the mid-Atlantic, which I then remembered and realized was actually, in the early days, was actually the preferred location for Atlantis. However, there was this study that came out in 1970, 78, I believe it was, and it was a book entitled Atlantis, Fact or Fiction. And what I thought was interesting about that was that purported to be the authoritative account of the Platonic story. And then after that, it was pretty much Atlantis was dismissed. Well, we know it was geologically impossible. So I addressed that whole question. And I have some quotes here that are kind of interesting. You'll see this. Okay, 1978. This was from the book Atlantis, Fact or Fiction. It was edited by Dorothy B. Vitaliano, who was a very highly respected woman geologist. And her contribution chapter was called Atlantis from the Geological Point of View. And she uses as her reference the work of Ignatius Donnelly. Are you familiar with Ignatius Donnelly? Okay, good man to look up. If you're doing Atlantean research, Ignatius Donnelly. He was a congressman from Minnesota. He was elected to Congress. I think he served 2 terms. I understood that his primary motive for running for Congress was so he could get to Washington and have access to the Library of Congress.
Wow.
Which he spent all of his time in the Library of Congress researching Atlantis, and then he wrote 2 books on Atlantis. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and Ragnarok, the Age of Fire and Gravel. In the second one is where he discusses his idea of the catastrophe that caused the destruction of Atlantis. And he makes the argument, and he makes a pretty strong argument for the reality of Atlantis. Even way back, published in 1882, I think, was Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, and maybe 83 or 84, the follow-up of it. Right? So Ignatius Donnelly. So Dorothy B. Vitaliano, she uses Ignatius Donnelly's account as her reference point. And this is what she says. Inasmuch as all references to Atlantis stem from Plato and no other source, which is almost true, in deciding whether it is fact or fiction, or to put it another way, whether it is a legend or myth, we are faced with three options. We can take everything Plato says quite literally. We can take his words seriously, but not literally, or we can take Atlantis as purely and simply his invention. Now, I was quite familiar with the second option, which was we can take his words seriously, but not literally. Okay, that's Santorini. That's Turkey. That's Doggerland. That's these other places of which there have been a proliferation of these, right? Well, my thought was, okay, what if we said option number one? We can take everything Plato says quite literally.
Yeah.
And I decided, okay, I think I'm just going to go down that road and see what I come up with. So then she goes on to say, the current popular concept of Atlantis was crystallized by Ignatius Donnelly in a book entitled Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, published in 1882. Since that book is still being sold in bookstores everywhere and has provided the basis for numerous other works, it is desirable to explain why his literal interpretation of Plato's description is utterly inconsistent with modern scientific knowledge. Oh. Donnelly outlined 13 propositions, in support of which he then proceeded to marshal all kinds of evidence. Only two of these propositions are relevant to a geologically oriented discussion. Proposition 1, that there once existed in the Atlantic Ocean, opposite the mouth of the Mediterranean Sea, a large island, which was the remnant of an Atlantic continent and known to the ancient world as Atlantis. And Proposition 2, that Atlantis perished in a terrible convulsion of nature in which the whole island sunk into the ocean with nearly all its inhabitants. So of his, 13 propositions, she says, okay, here's the two that have geological relevance. And if they don't hold water, if they're
pun intended.
Right, pun intended. If they don't, stand on their own or sink, then all the other propositions are meaningless. We don't even need to look at them.
Yeah.
We can just throw them out, right? So that's her approach. Then she says, in light of what is known today, I imagine she's writing this about 1977, about the ocean floors, we can definitely rule out the possibility of a sunken landmass of any substantial size in the Atlantic, or for that matter, in any other ocean basin. It has now been established from the speed at which earthquake vibrations propagate through the earth that the material of the Earth's crust underlying the continents is different from the material underlying the ocean floors. Nowhere in the ocean basins is there any sign of a large mass of continental-type crust, which could represent a submerged continent. Well, here we're getting in continent. What do we mean by that? Continent.
Yeah.
Right? As opposed to Plato's use of the word Greek term nesos, nun, epsilon, sigma, omicron, sigma, which means island. Means island, okay? So she's pretty confident about what we know about the ocean basins, right? Um, so she then says that with an Atlantic site ruled out as physically impossible, all arguments that are based on racial, linguistic, or other cultural similarities on both sides of the ocean, which he documents pretty exhaustively,
Mm-hmm.
which would include the rest of Donnelly's 13 propositions, must collapse. With an Atlantic site ruled out as physically impossible, all other arguments must collapse.
Okay.
So, having considered the various possibilities, let us return to the original question. Is Atlantis myth or legend? I've tried to show that an Atlantic site, and with it a literal interpretation of Plato's description, is ruled out by our present knowledge of the sea floors. The very best we can do is to grant that Plato might have derived some of his ideas from Minoan Crete
Mm-hmm.
in one way or another, but such a derivation is far too roundabout for Atlantis to qualify as a legend which presents a distorted view of an actual event. From the geological point of view, I fear that Atlantis must be considered just another of the myths of Plato. That was considered to be the final word
Okay.
on Atlantis in 1978.
Okay.
And what you see is that post this publication of this work, anybody who's looking at proposition number 2, well, we take Plato seriously, but not historically accurate.
Mm-hmm.
You find this proliferation of all of these other sites
Sure.
around the world. Well, then I came in and I said, okay, let's take Plato literally and see what happens. And so what that led me to was some stuff very interesting. So why don't we get back to the story?
Yeah.
How did he get to Plato? Well, there was a lineage from
Solon. Yeah.
the transmittal from Solon to I'm not sure how to pronounce it. It's either Dropidas or Dropidas. I think it's Dropidas. Now Solon was about 600 BC. He told the story to Dropidas, who then told it to Critias the Elder,
Mm-hmm.
who was the grandfather of Critias the Younger, who was the one narrating the story in the forum.
Yes.
Right? And then it goes, so the line of transmission would have been from Solon to Dropidas to Critias the Elder to Critias the Younger, and from him then to Plato. Plato wrote it down, and that's what we've inherited, right? So here's what, let's see here. Here's what, at the beginning of Timaeus, Critias
Mm-hmm.
is speaking. He said, "Then listen, Socrates, to a strange tale, which is, however," important point, "certainly true,
Yes.
as Solon, who was the wisest of the 7 sages, declared. He was a relative and a great friend of my great-grandfather Dropidas, as he himself says in several of his poems. And Dropidas told Critias, my grandfather, who remembered and told us." I'm going to skip over a little bit here, just we obviously don't have time to go through the whole thing, but this is what he goes on to tell. "There were of old great and marvelous actions of the Athenians, which have passed into oblivion through time and the destruction of the human race." Now, I think we need to take what Plato is saying right there at face value.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Passed into oblivion through time and the destruction of the human race. And one in particular, which was the greatest of them all, the recital of which will be a suitable testimony of our gratitude to you, and also a hymn of praise true and worthy of the goddess, which may be sung by us at the festival in her honor. Socrates then says, "Very good. And what is this ancient famous action of which Critias spoke? Not as mere legend, but as veritable action of the Athenian state, which Solon recounted.
Mm-hmm.
So now we have a second iteration of that idea.
Yeah.
Socrates himself is now saying that this was not mere legend. It was not mere legend. That's what Socrates is saying, but a veritable action, a true action, something that really happened.
Right.
Right? So Critias says, I will tell an old world story, which I heard from an aged man. For Critias was, as I said at that time, nearly 90 years of age, and I was about 10 years of age. Now the day was that day of the Apaturia, which is called the registration of youth, at which, according to custom, our parents gave prizes for recitations. And the poems of several poets were recited by us boys, and many of us sang the poems of Solon, which were new at the time. If Solon had only, and you mentioned this, like other poets, made poetry the business of his life and had completed the tale which he brought with him from Egypt, and not been compelled by reason of the factions and troubles which he found stirring in this country when he came home, to attend to other matters, in my opinion, he would have been as famous as Homer, Hesiod, or any other poet. And what was the poem about, Critias? About the greatest action which the Athenians ever did, and which ought to have been the most famous, but which, again, through the lapse of time and the destruction of the actors, has not come down to us. Now, I think that we could marshal evidence, a mountain of evidence, completely independent of what we just heard,
Mm-hmm.
that supports the idea that there have been many destructions of the human race. That there are times when the human species has been proliferating upon the world, and other times when it has seen a gigantic drop in population numbers. I think we see that right at the Younger Dryas. We also see it repeatedly happen just throughout the 10 or 11,000 years of the Holocene, right? So I think that what Plato's describing here is absolutely, thoroughly tenable scientifically. After his travels, Solon comes to Egypt, and there he was received by the Egyptians with great honor, and he asked the priests, who were most skillful in such matters, about antiquity, and made the discovery that neither he nor any other Hellene or Greek knew anything worth mentioning about the times of old. On one occasion, when he was drawing them on to speak of antiquity, he began to tell about the most ancient things in our part of the world, about Phronius, who is called the first, and about Niobe, and after the deluge, to tell of the lives of Deucalion and Pyrrha. And he traced the genealogy of their descendants and attempted to reckon how many years old were the events of which he was speaking, and to give dates. Thereupon, one of the priests, who was of a very great age, said, "O Solon, Solon, you Hellenes are but children, and there is not an old man among you who is a Hellene." In other words, there's not an old wizened person, right? Solon, hearing this, said, "What do you mean?" The priest then replied, "I mean to say that in mind you are all young. There's no old opinion handed down among you by ancient tradition, nor any science which is hoary with age. And I'll tell you the reason for this. There have been, and will be again, many destructions of mankind arising out of many causes. The greatest have been brought about by the agencies of fire and water, and other lesser ones by innumerable other causes." And then he goes on to tell a story which I consider very significant in unpacking what follows in the story of Atlantis, right? This is what he says. And see how you interpret this. This is the old priest talking to Solon. There is a story which even you know, pathetic young Greeks who don't know anything about antiquity, even you have preserved this story, that once upon a time, Phaeton, the son of Helios, do you know that myth?
Yeah. Yeah. He
Phaeton
tries to drive the chariot and then it
of
like
the
ends in,
sun.
and it ends in him crashing. Yeah.
Yes. Once upon a time, Phaeton, the son of Helios, yoked the steeds of his father's chariot. But because he was not able to drive them in the path of his father, burned up all that was upon the earth, and was himself destroyed by a thunderbolt. Now this is what I consider to be some of the most important line out of the whole Atlantis narrative. This is what he says. Now this has the form of a myth, but it really signifies a declination of the bodies moving around the earth and in the heavens, and a great conflagration of all things upon the earth, recurring at long intervals of time.
Mm. Yeah. So it sounds like a cyclical
Mm-hmm.
destruction that came from the heavens that could coincide with that Younger Dryas period, which could be some kind of body that
Yes,
struck the earth.
absolutely, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean,
I'm,
it's like the
I'm
pieces.
down. Yeah, I'm down with it actually being a god crashing on Earth too. That'd be cool.
Okay, and in following, I have excerpts from Bulfinch's mythology on the fall of Phaeton. We won't get into that, but if anybody wants to read Bulfinch's mythology, look up the story of Phaeton and read it.
Yeah.
Because I think that Plato's just telling us, it has a form of myth, but he's really
Right.
describing these bodies that are orbiting into heavens. They decline. That means a downward motion. They're coming down, setting fire to the earth, causing catastrophes. And now we know indisputably that happens with a degree of regularity too.
Yeah.
So I wish I could share my screen. I would show you the some of the paintings here about the fall of Phaeton.
Yeah, I'll definitely I'll put those up for sure.
Yeah.
So how did you then not to spoil, but then how did you arrive at the Azores?
Well, okay, so okay. We're gonna have to skip over some juicy stuff.
Well, we
but
don't
we
have
can
to. I
go.
mean, if there's something you want to add, feel free.
Okay, well let's get to that, and we'll make it a point to get to that before we conclude our discussion.
There's something else that's a bit of a non sequitur that I've been dying to ask you too. That's a Plato thing. That's a geometry thing that I really wanted to see what you have to say about it. But yeah.
Okay, so then jumping past the a great conflagration of all things upon the earth recurring at long intervals of time. He then goes on to say, when this happens, those who live upon the mountains and in the dry and lofty places are more liable to destructions than those who dwell by rivers or on the seashore. And from this calamity, the Nile, who is our never-failing Savior, saves and delivers us. When, on the other hand, the gods purge the earth with a deluge of water, among you, herdsmen and shepherds on the mountains are the survivors, whereas those of you who live in cities are carried by the rivers into the sea. And I mentioned earlier the work that I've been doing with LIDAR, showing that virtually every river that I've now investigated, certainly all over North America, and as we're learning more, for example.
What we just saw in Texas, man, I mean, it can happen like that.
Yes, and
what
we saw in Texas.
Where I live, I got to tell you this, Randall, right where I live, literally on my street, we got crazy rainfall one night.
Yeah.
The street next to me was like burying cars.
Yeah.
Like it can happen so quickly in ways that we don't even begin to appreciate until something like that happens.
Well, I cite the story of my first initiation into Paleohydrology, which I didn't even know the term then, was 1969. And some of these comments that have come in were like, it's I don't know, it's the TikTok brain.
Ification, yeah, for sure. It's brain rot. It's social media brain rot for
It's
sure.
social media brain rot that's an epidemic now. But I was sitting on the bluffs overlooking the Minnesota River Valley. The bluffs are about 200 to 250 feet high above the valley, and where I was sitting looking out over the valley was 3 miles wide, and on the opposite side there's another set of bluffs. And I had this epiphany. I had this sense that because what I could see was directly below me, the modern Minnesota River had migrated, had meandered over to the base of the bluffs that I was sitting on. So I could very clearly see that it had entrenched itself, and there were small escarpments on either side of the river. And I remember looking at those and then seeing this larger valley and thinking they were almost like scaled counterparts of each other. And I thought, God, wouldn't that be incredible if this whole thing was once a big river? And then I thought, but no, that's not how it works in geology. It must have been the modern little river that I see down there now must have carved out this huge valley over many, many, many thousands, hundreds of thousands, or even millions of years. And I kind of forgot about it. And this is 1969. And then basically between 8 and 10 years later, I really began to get obsessed with catastrophism. And I began doing research, and one of the things I came across was evidence that was emerging around 1980 for several things. Cataclysmic floods on a giant scale and asteroid impacts. 1980, remember, there was 3 independent papers published that all attributed the sudden mass extinction of the dinosaurs to some variant of a cosmic impact. And that opened the door to like a reconsideration of catastrophes in Earth history, right? Now, years later, it took me probably until the mid-'80s that the studies came out that I was able to access, and I learned that the southern outlet of gigantic inland freshwater sea, Lake Agassiz, that was a gigantic sea of glacial meltwater, one of its 3 major discharge points was at a place called Big Stone Lake, which is on the western border of Minnesota and the 2 Dakotas. And if anybody wants to, they can look at a map, and you'll see this weird bump you come down the western border of Minnesota. You see this weird bump. It's right there. That was the outburst point, southern outburst point of Lake Agassiz. And a gigantic rush of water came through there. It has been named by geologists Glacial River Warren. And the estimates are that the peak discharge of Glacial River Warren, a temporary river, was 4,000 times greater than that of the Minnesota River. So that first intimation I had, I realized, well, yeah, that was real. I was having this impression of this giant river, and there really was a giant river. Later, I discovered, not much later, that there was a whole school of geology, was not prominent within geology. It was not taught in geological schools, but it was called underfit rivers. And it was a term coined by a geologist named Dury. I think he wrote it in the 50s or 60s. And basically what he was saying is that there's a lot of rivers that are flowing in these huge valleys. And those small rivers that are flowing in those valleys now did not create those valleys. They're underfit. Now, if you have a river that's only 1/4,000th of the flow that carved the valley, once that river's in the valley, it ain't getting out again. Well, so what I've gone on to learn is that virtually every river I have now looked at, North America, South America, Africa, Europe, and Asia, has at one time or another carried gigantic flows. Now, let's think about when modern civilization rose from, between 3,000 and 5,000 years ago, where do we see the first settlements? They're along rivers. They're along coastlines, right? Now, if you have a village, even a city along a river, and then a flood comes through with a peak discharge 1,000, 2,000, 4,000 times greater than the river that's flowing there, what's going to be left of your village, of your city, of your settlement?
Nothing. Yeah.
Nothing.
Yeah.
Nothing. Just like Plato says, whereas those of you who live in cities are carried by the rivers into the sea.
Right.
Once again, I think Plato is telling us an explicit truth. Nothing so far is, we can't dismiss with a wave of the hand anything he said up to this point. Then he goes on. He says, the fact is that wherever the extremity of winter frost or of summer sun does not prevent, the human race is always increasing at times, but at other times is diminishing in numbers. And whatever happened either in your country or in ours or in any other region of which we are informed, if any action which is noble or great or in any other way remarkable has taken place, all that has been written down of old and is preserved in our temples. But whereas you and other nations are just being provided with letters and other things which states requires, and then at the usual interval, the stream from heaven descends like a pestilence and leaves only those of you who are destitute of letters and education, and thus you have to begin all over again as children and know nothing of what happened in ancient times, either among us or among yourselves.
Yeah.
I think he's laying it out right there.
It makes so much sense.
Yeah. As for those genealogies of yours, which you have recounted to us, Solon, they are no better than the tales of children. For in the first place, you remember one deluge only.
Yes.
Whereas there were many of them.
Yeah.
In the next place, you do not know that there dwelt in your land the fairest and noblest race of men, of who you and your whole city are but a seed or remnant.
Yeah, now we're getting into the,
And this was unknown to you because for many generations, the survivors of that destruction died and left no sign.
Yeah.
I can't even read that without the goosebumps.
Yeah.
Going
absolutely.
big on my,
Yeah. And again, this plays into this idea that seems to surface over and over and over again, not just in our conversations, but in any exploration of these great megalithic civilizations, that there was some distant ancestral advanced group or groups that were all over the world. And this idea of like a pre-Diluvian Athens is equally interesting to me.
Yes.
And I don't know if there's like any evidence for that you've drummed up, but
some, yes. I and that is one of my areas of research that I'm really going to look into is, the geological history of the peninsula there. And I know there's going to be a story there because there's nowhere that I've looked, basically nowhere that I've looked where I can't find somewhere that was not at some time or another affected by catastrophic events. We can say that there are some areas where it looks like catastrophism played a much more powerful role. And very briefly, one of the barometers that I would use is species loss.
Yeah.
Because species loss is a function of habitat loss. Habitat loss is going to be a function of catastrophic environmental changes. Right? Now, if we look at the numbers of species lost around the Younger Dryas and in the millennia or two leading up to the Younger Dryas, say between Meltwater Pulse 1A at about 14,600 to the end of the Younger Dryas at 11,600, 3,000-year period. North America lost 3/4 of all species over 100 pounds in body weight. So did South America. Yeah.
So if there's something that mirrors that in that part of the world, that would be very suggestive.
Yes. Now, Eurasia lost about 35% of its megafaunal species. Africa, 10 or 12%. So obviously the destructive potential was not uniformly distributed around the planet. If species loss is a barometer, a measuring stick for that.
Right.
It really appears that the Western Hemisphere received the brunt of whatever forces caused this. And I think the argument can be made that we're looking like Plato's describing the myth of Phaeton and the stream from heaven. You know, we're talking about is this newly discovered Comet Swan, which is going to cross Earth's orbit coming up very soon. And then Earth is going to cross its orbit on October 5th. Well, is that going to cause a meteor shower? Maybe. I hope it does. Not any big catastrophic impacts, but a nice light show. That would be cool. But okay, let's go to the next where the narrative goes, because this now gets us into some of the specifics. Okay. So here's the priest talking again. Many great and wonderful deeds are recorded of your state in our histories. But one of them exceeds all the rest in greatness and valor, for these histories tell of a mighty power, which was aggressing wantonly against the whole of Europe and Asia, and to which your city put an end. This power, now this is very clear and explicit, came forth out of the Atlantic Ocean. For in those days the Atlantic was navigable, and there was an island situated in front of the straits, which you call the columns of Heracles. Now, you can research the column of Heracles, and overwhelmingly, the consensus is that that's referring to what is now the Straits of Gibraltar. Other places have been proposed, but I think it's clear from the context of this narrative that those other places are not being referred to, right? There was an island situated in front of the straits, which you call the columns of Heracles. The island was larger than Libya and Asia put together. Now, again, we get back to where this meaning, and we have to go back to the Greek for that, I think, because we see that the islands, plural, right? So again, using Polynesia, Micronesia, etc., as a possible analogy, if we're looking at not a single island, but a group of islands that are spread over large parts of the ocean, right? But then what he says here, that there was an island situated in front of the straits, which you call the columns of Heracles. Now, if that means outside, into the west of them, but that's where Madeira is found. There's another island called Spartel Bank, which was an island during the Ice Age. It is now acknowledged by geologists to have sunk. It's just outside, almost within the Straits of Gibraltar, and surrounding it is huge masses of thick turbidites, which is basically sediment that has been deposited on extreme turbidity current. So in other words, something happened, you have this earthquake, the Spartel Bank collapses, and it throws billions of tons of sediment up into the water. The water is turbulent because of the earthquake, and then it settles out. And instead of forming nice, even, consistent layers, like a nice sandwich layered up, it's full of contortions and distortions and things, and that is a turbidite.
Okay.
So there's massive turbidites on the Atlantic Ocean floor outside the Straits of Gibraltar. They're there, okay? Now, listen to this carefully. So this island was the way to other islands, and from the other islands, you might pass to the whole of the opposite continent, which surrounded the true ocean. For this sea, which is within the Straits of Heracles, is only a harbor, having a narrow entrance, but that other is a real sea, and the surrounding land may be most truly called a continent. Now, if you take this at face value, I mean, it almost sounds like you're saying, well, you can go. I mean, we can look at a map, and next time we can pull up a map, I'll show you. You go out of the west of the Straits of Gibraltar, you encounter, first you sail over the sunken Spartel Bank, then you come to Madeira, then you come to the Azores, then beyond the Azores, you come to the true continent. I mean, that's really, I mean, the geography fits what he just explained to a T. Now, how do you reconcile the Reshat structure with what you just heard?
Yeah, it doesn't fit.
It doesn't. It doesn't add up. I'm sorry. It's an interesting structure, and it's worthy of study in its own right. But it doesn't.
And it does look like it got flooded.
And it probably did. The whole of North Africa got flooded.
Mm-hmm.
And in the American College Dictionary that I've had, my tattered version that I've had since 1967, Pillars of Hercules, the two promontories on the opposite sides of the Strait of Gibraltar, the Rock Gibraltar in Europe, and the Jebel Musa in Africa are fabled to have been raised by Hercules.
Yeah.
And that is the overwhelmingly dominant interpretation of what is meant.
Mm-hmm. And you're going there soon.
Yes.
To the Azores. Yeah.
Yeah. Yep. So then Critias says, now therefore, and this is the purpose of all that I have been saying, I am ready to tell my tale, not in summary outline only, but in full detail, just as I heard it, and the city with its citizens, which you described to us yesterday, as it were in fable, we will now transport hither into the realm of fact.
Right.
And then again, Socrates says, what story should we adopt, Critias, in preference to this? For this story will be admirably suited to the festival of the goddess, which is now being held, because of its connection with her, and the fact that it is no invented fable, but genuine history.
Yeah.
Is all important.
Yeah.
Now, again, my point, you cannot derive the conclusion from the narrative self that he meant this as a myth.
Totally.
He seems over and over again to be confirmed this is real.
Yeah. Especially because he does often say, let me tell a myth. Let me, like, this is something that's like a trope in Plato's dialogues, is he'll say, this is a myth. Like I said before, this is a logos. Sometimes he'll say, this is a likely myth, things like that. So, but if the fact that he's saying over and over again that this is not a myth, that is, I mean, I don't know how he dismissed that.
But they do.
Right.
Well, because since 1978, it was demonstrated that, his geology was an impossibility. Or was it?
Yeah.
So, yeah, now here's the part referring to Greece. He says, for the survivors of each destruction, as I have already said, dwelt in the mountains. They were ignorant of the art of writing and had heard only the names of the chiefs of the land and very little about their actions, as they themselves and their children were for many generations in want of the necessities of life. They directed their attention to the supply of their wants, and of that they discoursed, to the neglect of events that had happened in times long past. For mythology and the inquiry into antiquity are introduced into cities when they have leisure, and when they see the necessaries of life already beginning to be provided, but not before. In other words, the survivors of a catastrophe are so wholly preoccupied with just the challenges of surviving that it's no wonder that ancient traditions might have been lost.
Right.
And now he's talking about Greece. I would have you observe the present aspect of the country, which is only a promontory extending far into the sea, way away from the rest of the continent. And the surrounding basin of the sea is everywhere deep in the neighborhood of the shore. Many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, for that is the number of years which have elapsed since the time of which I am speaking. The consequence is that, in comparison of what then was, there are remaining in small islets only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called. All the richer and softer parts of the soil have fallen away, and the mere skeletons of the country being left. But in former days, and in the primitive state of the country, what are now mountains were only regarded as hills, and the plains, as they are now termed, of Phaeton, were full of rich earth, and there was abundance of wood in the mountains. Of this last, the traces still remain, for there are some of the mountains which now only afford sustenance to bees, whereas not long ago they were still remaining roofs cut from the trees growing there, which were of a size sufficient to cover the largest houses, and there were many other high trees bearing fruit and abundance of food for cattle. Moreover, the land enjoyed rain from heaven year by year, not as now, losing the water which flows off the earth into the sea, but having an abundance in all places, and receiving and treasuring up in the close clay soil the water which drained from the heights, and letting this off into the hollows, providing everywhere abundant streams of fountains and rivers, and there may still be observed indications of them in ancient sacred places, where there are fountains, and this proves the truth of what I am saying. Well, you can see how within the framework of geomorphology, I look at that and say, well, yeah, it sounds like he's describing a tremendous erosional event that affected the whole Greek peninsula. Such was the natural state of the country, which was cultivated, as we may well believe, by true husbandmen, and had a soil, the best in the world, and an abundance of water, and in the heaven above an excellently tempered climate. Now the city in those days was arranged on this wise. In the first place, the Acropolis was not as now, for the fact is that a single night of excessive rain washed away the earth and laid bare the rock. At the time there were earthquakes, and then occurred the third extraordinary inundation, which immediately preceded the great destruction of Deucalion.
Yeah. It does not sound like a myth. It sounds like an actual telling of an event that occurred. I mean, like a myth needs to, I mean, there are other things that we're not reading within this whole story. You know, there's a whole story about sort of how ancient Athens is supposed to be a model for an actual sort of ideal city state that existed, and Atlantis is supposed to sort of be this overcomplicated, overly bloated, too many, too much excess within the society. So there are these other things that you could put mythological sort of constraints around, but all of these like parts of the story that are just meteorological, it just sounds like they're trying to retell a truth.
Yeah. I mean, nothing that I just read to you is outlandish from the standpoint of we know the things that happen climatologically and environmentally, and
it doesn't contribute to any myth. Like it doesn't contribute to some like mythological narrative where they're trying to communicate some other truth through a myth. It just sounds like they're reporting facts.
Yeah. Well, and then we get into, and this answers your question, how did I focus in on, well, I've kind of given you, I've skipped over some, but enough from Plato, what he's describing, right? So I'm going to now quote from an article that appeared in National Geographic back in 1948, written by Maurice Ewing, who is considered to be the founding father of marine geology. Okay, you look him up. He's a very distinguished scientist, no longer with us, of course. But so it begins with this quote: "We're over the ridge." And that's referring to the mid-Atlantic ridge. All hands were tense as the word spread through the little research vessel named, get this, Atlantis. For it meant we had reached our goal. A mile or so beneath our keel stretched the gloom-shrouded peaks, valleys, and ridges of the longest mountain system on Earth, the mysterious mid-Atlantic ridge which we had come to explore. Though our ship was named Atlantis, we had no illusions of solving that age-old mystery. But a rather wild idea had led us to devote 4 hours to a particular rock dredging. Our hypothesis was that the long, level terraces, with sediments ranging up to 3,000 feet in depth, were submerged shorelines.
Wow.
If so, the steep cliffs rising from them should have boulders at their bases, as do wave-cut cliffs on our shorelines today. Okay. It is, of course, extremely radical speculation to identify these level stretches more than 2 miles below the sea surface as former beaches. Such a theory would require the obvious but almost incredible conclusion that the land here has subsided 2 miles, or else the sea has risen by that amount. Much work will have to be done before this startling theory can be proved or disproved. In any case, we were encouraged to find that at the bases of the cliffs above such terraces, rocks indeed could be readily obtained. And then in their journey, at another point, they say about halfway between New York and Bermuda, we brought up one of our most remarkable cores. They took cores from the bottom of the... It included sand like that found on beaches. Well, how did beach sand get here, 300 miles from any shallow water? I decided that it must have come from a mountain, now beneath the surface of the sea, and predicted that such a seamount would be found nearby. Months later, in April, a mountain, as forecast, was discovered by the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute. Then, the following year, they went back.
Okay.
They saw enough stuff that was intriguing, and they said, we got to do a follow-up.
Yeah.
So the next year, 49, they go back. Stand by to lower away. As this cry sounded, all hands crowded to the rail of our little research ship, Atlantis, rolling easily as she lay hove to on the gray mid-ocean swells. It was a tense but eagerly awaited moment on our second voyage of exploration of the mid-Atlantic ridge, the world's longest mountain range, which runs a full mile deep under almost the whole length of the Atlantic Ocean. Some of the things we found on this second cruise create scientific puzzles. One was the discovery of prehistoric beach sand in 2 core samples of the bottom, brought up in one case from a depth of 2 and the other nearly 3.5 miles, far from any place where beaches exist today. So sometime in the distant past, this sand found deep beneath the ocean must have been located on a beach, at or near the surface of the sea. Either the land must have sunk 2 or 3 miles, or the sea once must have been 2 or 3 miles lower than now. But either conclusion is startling.
Yeah.
Now, it goes from there. Here's the ocean floor. This is from Hans Petersen. This is from a book called The Ocean Floor, published in 1958. Hans Petersen was a Swedish, or was he Norwegian? Swedish marine geologist. A very different type of deep-sea sand is found about 1,500 nautical miles further west, slightly north of the equator. Here, from a depth of about 4,400 meters, the core sampler brought up a core nearly 9 meters long, the upper parts of which consisted of a fairly homogeneous, fine-grained deep-sea clay. In the lower part, several layers of sand, which mineralogical examination showed to be not mafic, which is the material composing the ocean floor, not mafic, but of continental origin. That is, derived from a coastal shelf of some continent or large island.
Boom. What's her name did not read these articles.
She did not do diligence.
Doesn't sound like it. What was her name again?
Dorothy Vitaliano.
She was a shill.
I think so.
But then it's like it just feels like who and why would be trying to dismiss or suppress it. That's what I just don't understand.
Well, we could get into that discussion, and we should, because I have thoughts on that.
Okay.
I do. And
what's what's the quick version? What's the quick version?
The quick version is look, modern science arose after a long, like 2 centuries long conflict between science and religion.
Yeah.
Between biblical literalism and the freedom to think and ask questions and frame hypotheses and test them, etc. The opposite of just blindly accepting something on faith.
Yeah.
Well, so part of this, I think, only part of it has to do with that, is that, if you start, like Noah's flood. Well, if you look at the simplistic versions of Noah's flood, they don't make sense. Only to somebody who's invested in a supernatural explanation that, well, you don't need a naturalistic explanation for the reality behind the flood stories, because God does things, it's supernatural. And we don't even question. It's God, right? Now the science has come along, and in authentic science, you question everything. Well, I think that's part of it, is that there was an overreaction. But I think there's also the other part, is that there is a narrative that's become entrenched, which is pretty much a framework for constructing this entire hierarchy of geopolitical power. And I think that has something to do with it. We should get into the question of, like, every time, what happens when the Chinese communists took over with Mao's revolution? What happened with Pol Pot? What happened with Stalin? What happened with Hitler? You erase history, right? Because you have to separate people from their authentic history, because now you're inculcating a manufactured narrative to which they're supposed to owe their allegiance. See? And I think there's a strong element of that. Because
and there's the other thing too is, if you accept the notion that there was this antediluvian advanced civilization, not just Atlantis, but also the pre-diluvian Athens, all of these other civilizations, it doesn't just change academia, it causes like ontological questions. And it's questions about, again, their technology. What happened to those people? Was that wisdom preserved? What did they know about reality that we don't know? And like that, those are the types of things that make me wonder, like, could those also be motivations for suppressing some of this stuff?
I think there's a multiplicity of reasons and factions whose vested interests would not be served by overthrowing the existing paradigms of history.
Yeah.
I think that's a big part of it. But if we're going to continue on and prosper and create a truly, authentically enduring civilization, we essentially are going to have to overthrow those paradigms, because they are now like dead weights around our neck. Because if we don't have an authentic understanding of our past, we're not going to have any hope of surviving into the future.
That is for sure.
Plato is giving us clear warnings. After the usual interval, the stream from heaven descends.
Yeah.
He's giving us clear warning right there. I do believe that. And we need to take that at face value. Now, there's a whole lot more we could unpack here. And that would lead us to the question of why in November I'm going to the Azores.
Yeah.
Because the 9 Azores islands are the tops of mountains. And they're sitting in they're mountains that are on what is now referred to a term that didn't exist I'm quite sure in the days of Dorothy Vitaliano, which is microcontinent.
Mm.
And I can show you, just as she said, now we know that, the basalt of the seafloor is mafic, meaning it's manganese and iron. It's not of continental crust. Well, guess what? The Azores microcontinent is continental
Ooh.
crust.
Ooh. I think you're onto
So,
something, my friend. I think you're onto something. And once again, I'm just blown away, as always, by the level of research you've done, you continue to do. You are just living this shit in a way that, like, I don't know many other people that are, especially from like such a multidisciplinary way where you can, read Plato, but then also you have this rich knowledge of geology and history and esotericism that gives you such like a unique perspective, man. So I just always have so much fun riffing with you. There's so much more. Like I sent you a big list of things we could talk about. Again, we like didn't even get to 2/3 of them. Again, we didn't get to the underground structures in Egypt. We didn't even get to my question I wanted to ask you about the geometry and Plato stuff.
oh,
So
well, we can definitely cover that at some point.
yeah, let's do
I've
it.
got, let's see if you can see this here.
Oh
There
yeah,
are
the
the five
the
platonic
solids.
solids right up
Yeah,
there,
yeah,
hand built in my shop.
that's awesome.
Um, and I think that they have unique properties. And this can lead us directly into the discussion of lost technologies.
Oh man! All right, a part three is coming. A part three is coming. Well, thanks again, man. This is so much fun. I absolutely love talking to you. Um, Anything else you want to say before we wrap it up?
I guess not for the moment. No, but after we should reconvene after I get back from my field trip,
Yeah, sounds good.
and I'd have something to share, talk about. I'm sure, so I'd have some stories,
Beautiful.
and yeah.
Can't wait. Safe travels, and yeah,
Thanks,
I
Michael.
can't wait for the next one. Hey,
When will? Do you have any idea when this will post?
yeah, It's gonna be like less than a week.
Okay, I will mention that I think we've got 3 or 4 seats left for
Oh,
this
cool.
Azores expedition
It's in November.
in November.
Okay.
I think it's, yeah. Go to my website. I've got something on there. Go to Grimerica.
Oh,
Darren
okay.
Grimes and Graham Dunlop are organizing it, and you can get your tickets through them.
I'll mention this in the introduction too, so it's not like buried at the very, very end.
Cool. And I got a new website. Mike Robertson is my partner over at HowTube, is building an awesome website.
Awesome.
And I can't wait to have it out there. People can see it. And the other thing that's in the development is we're designing a school.
Yeah.
We have just made an offer on 260 acres of land,
Ooh,
Cumberland Plateau in Tennessee.
huge.
So we'll see what comes of that.
I can't wait. Can't wait to
I know
go.
it's exciting times. But we got to do this because,
Yeah.
there are forces of good that could carry us to heights we can't even begin to imagine. And then there are other dark forces at work that really want to constrict us, restrict us, endless forever wars, which of course can't last forever because sooner or later it's going to explode into something that's out of control.
Yeah.
And in a world of, where we're sitting here with, nuclear weapons poised at each other, we've got to have dialogue, we've got to have cooperation, and this is something that should be something that we talk about further because there are potentials for another pathway, for another route. We are literally at the crossroads right now, I believe.
Yeah.
Not only for the history of civilization, but the history of our humankind, human species on Earth.
Yeah.
And it's going to come down to what really just a few of us, I think, are doing. Um, but we can tip the scales, I think, towards progression and evolution rather than de-evolution.
Yeah.
So that's something we should talk about because Plato has given us lessons, and a lot of the other traditions have as well. And they've pointed our way into a future that we can only just begin to imagine. the potential of what we could be and where we could be at a century from now. And it's up to us who are alive on the earth now to make sure that this happens.
Amen, my friend. Bless you,
All right,
Randall.
Michael.
Thank you
Thank
for
you,
everything you're
Michael.
doing. Hang on for me when I hit
I
stop
will.
here.
I will.